welcome. Thank you, everybody. It's so exciting. It's like a full house. It's great. Thanks for coming. So again, I'm Maura Reilly, and I am delighted to be here to share the stage with one of my favorite people, Jessie Jones, very famous feminist artist, obviously Dublin-based, who is a distant Irish relative, we like to tell people.
That's why
inevitably related, and our shamrocks, exactly. That's why we have those there. So if I can have the next slide. Great. You're looking at it here on one side and next to you in another. So included in chapter 2 of Transfeminisms is this hanging sculpture by Jessie called Thurible. And we'll speak about its significance at length in a little bit, but that's one of the reasons why we're here today, is to talk about the connection between this work and a current body of work that's on view in Birmingham, which we'll talk about again in a second. So we will have the distinct pleasure of having Jessie and Stephanie, Stephanie's last name? Lamprea, activate the Thurible this evening, and there'll be a ritual ceremony and some singing as well, and an incredible performance. So that's a really exciting part of tonight's event. So if I could have the next 2 slides, or just one, actually, yeah. So Jessie and I got to know each other in 2017 when she represented Ireland at the Venice Biennale with a piece here called Tremble Tremble, a multimedia installation that was extraordinary. This work actually, interestingly, relates to her current work that's on view again in Birmingham. So we wanted to start by talking about this piece and then relate it in the end to Thurible. So there's a really wonderful kind of connection between this earlier work and what we're going to see tonight. So I wanted you, Jessie, to kind of tell folks about this really, really complex, interesting piece that has multiple components.
So I developed this for the National Pavilion for Ireland for the Venice Biennale in 2017. And at the time I was really compelled by the idea of making a national pavilion that spoke to something within the kind of nation state or the statecraft of Ireland at the time. And we had gone through this kind of, I guess if people know a little bit, there's some Irish faces in the room. We've had quite an interesting political decade in Ireland where we've had a lot of reformation and almost a kind of like unstrangling ourselves from like a very particular Catholic theocracy, and that's been a kind of generational change. Around 2015 there was the marriage equality referendum, and on the back of marriage equality I was really engaged with a lot of activists who were talking about a particular artifact in the Irish constitution called the 8th Amendment. And there was this kind of growing and bubbling tension and ambition on the ground among the feminist movement to repeal this particular article of the constitution that banned abortion. So I, in a way, as an artist, was really excited to use the National Pavilion to stage an uncomfortable conversation. But in order to do that, to really use kind of like a mythopoesis or kind of poetic myth making that would take some archetypes and kind of garble them and kind of make them strange, so you could have this very indirect conversation about abortion rights and kind of stage it within the history of the European witch trials in particular. I was very influenced by a dear friend and an amazing woman called Silvia Federici, who wrote a book called Caliban and the Witch, which I can see from nods in the audience that there's a couple of fans for Silvia. And Silvia also kind of talked to me about the 1970s witch, la Charmate, la Strenga son tornate, which was in the 70s. There was a big social movement called Wages for Housework in Italy, where they said, tremble, tremble, the witches are coming. And this was a really compelling kind of political spell to me, that, thinking about what happens when you're on the threshold of change, what happens when you're on the precipice of change. The world seems to tremble, and it can tremble in a good way or it can tremble in a bad way, as we all know. But I was interested in that kind of witchy trembling that would give birth to, ironically, an amazing social movement that repealed the 8th Amendment. So at the time when the work was staged, there was a constitution in the Irish, there was an article in the Irish Constitution that was put in the 1980s, which equated the life of the woman to her unborn fetus, which when you say out loud now is so shocking to think that we had the same legal constitutional subjectivity rights as an unborn fetus. And that was very difficult growing up with that, and being a woman in like my childbearing years, being a woman that knew that if anything happened, I'd have the equal rights in the Constitution as the unborn fetus. And I was so angry about this. And that anger became a kind of spark to make an artwork about it. So it's an artwork that is very, I worked a lot with Alwyn Fuere, who's an incredible actor and performer, and some of you might recognise Alwyn from so many things. But Alwyn also kind of really took the project to the next level as a performer and really embodied stories of women during the witch trials, brought it to another space,
And the fossil, Lucy,
Australopithecus. There was another thing as well about giantism, if I could just say one or two lines about that. The project itself was about kind of dwarfing the body. The article in the Irish Constitution equated women with a fetus, and I really had this feeling of wow, this is exactly like Gulliver's Travels, the Jonathan Swift story. This kind of crazy idea, this kind of really strange imaginary idea that there's these tiny fetal agents that have control of you, So I kind of use that idea of Swift's, which Jonathan Swift is obviously an Irish incredible writer, but also very, very critical of emerging capitalism and colonialism. So that kind of Swiftian descent became a strategy to kind of use that kind of Swift metaphor as a way of dealing with the really complex issue around how to speak about abortion rights in Ireland, but speak about it in the place of art was really important to me, to speak about how we fight for constitutional subjectivity, how we fight against repressive regimes of the state in a former theocracy or a loosening theocracy, and actually how contemporary art can be this incredible kind of place where very complex ideas can be held in a way where they're not dogmatic, where they kind of live in imagination as well,
Yeah, and the piece imagines a different legal order. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the legal order is a kind of counter to the Eighth Amendment, the Lilliputian fetus and woman equal subject. And it composes a legal order called Utera Gigante, which says that the rights of the womb are higher than the rights of the law of the state, and the womb and women's bodies are a more hierarchical law, and any law by man that tries to affect the body of a woman is null and doesn't exist, because it's a superior law of the body in terms of having rights and autonomy over your own body. So I worked with an amazing lawyer and constitutional academic called Maura Reilly, who I'd worked with a lot before, and we just kind of went through some texts and pulled pieces out of kind of legal artifacts and the Constitution itself, and then rewrote it as a declarative piece. And you can see it in the far side there, where it's a giant mouth. It's like Samuel Beckett's Not I, but vertical, like a kind of vagina dentata. So it's this kind of huge cave that speaks this other law. So kind of using the Irish National Pavilion to declare another legal paradigm through art is kind of what was going on there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the importance of the way in which she will articulate the words is also, I think, of utmost importance in relation later to, Mirror Martyr, Mirror Moon.
Yeah. I think it's because I work with incredible performers, and Alwyn is an absolute master of stagecraft and the body and performance. She's incredible and has a very, very established and long career as a theatre maker and artist, and just kind of using the body as a kind of language machine where we kind of separate emotion, and the body is a kind of machine of articulation, and how legal words, like one of my hobbies is to go to like courtrooms and like watch trials, but no, seriously, it's actually, so I really get a lot from going and seeing like how the law like enacts itself, and you know, like you only end up in court if something goes wrong, but it's good to go to court every now and again and just see what it's like when something goes wrong for other people, and kind of, you know, like not in a bad way, like it helps you build up a kind of empathetic capacity for what the law actually means and how it affects people's lives, because otherwise it goes like this to us. So I attended a lot of trials. One trial I attended quite religiously, ironically, was the symphysiotomy trials in Ireland, which were this really violent form of obstetric violence, and there was a huge tribunal trial that lasted about a year, about 5 years ago, and just seeing the way testimony was extracted from women who were in their 70s about their body and how cold it was and how kind of exacting it was in terms of how language is used, it made me really kind of focus on actually just something very much about how we perform language through the body when we deliver testimony. It's not very, like, it's not an effective thing, it's actually a very mechanical thing. You either get it right and you have credibility, or you don't, and you don't have credibility. So I was really interested in that as a performance brief for an actor like Olwen Poiré, like, you know, she's got so much complexity.
Which she took to a whole new level. It's extraordinary. If we could go to the next slide, we have a clip of Olwen talking about this new legal order that Jessie was just describing. I think you have to hit play, actually. Thanks.
The speaker's gone to sleep. Her mouth is upside down. That's an accident, but I'm into it. So we're just like,
oh, it is.
Yeah, because she's actually meant to be like standing up like a vagina dentata, but it's kind of cool upside down. So let's just pretend I planned that, okay?
Okay. That's actually cool. Are you sure?
Yeah, because see her top teeth are on the bottom. No, maybe it's not.
No, it's not.
No, it's the right way around.
It's the right way around.
Okay, we'll flip it next time.
Before the book of the law was written in earthly tongues, there existed another law, passed down through generations, daughter to daughter. Its letters were written in milk and spoken in whispers. With regard to the moment when a human takes its place of dwelling in the maternal belly, it lives inside a giant. This giant is the only true origin of law. She possesses the double kindness to create or destroy the life she carries. Her tenant is only temporary, its claim of occupancy finite, its very existence not mere life, as we, the living, know, but the greater possibility of being or not being. It needs not the society of man to become manifest. It obeys the natural law of inaugural gigante. The world within the world made of flesh.
not the state of land, or sea, or man, or sky. This brief stay in Terra Gigante is the only just and true law a human will ever know. Its borders made of bones, its legal arguments groans and coos and stretches. The sound of rushing blood, its architecture, a floating universe made of laughter and tears.
That deserves a clap, right? Extraordinary. I'm so glad we looked at that again and shared that with you. Keep that in mind because we'll be talking about the exhibition Mirror Martyr, Mirror Moon, MMMM, which is again on view in Birmingham at Icon, and we'll link it back to this piece. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Let's talk a little bit about that. If you could just put forward the next slide. So this is an installation shot. And again, like the last piece, Tremble Tremble, there are multiple components. So one of the things I love about Jessie's work is there's the screen or the scrim curtain, which you saw in the last piece, Tremble Tremble. There's an object here, it's a painting, which we'll talk about. There's also another object, or multiple objects, sculpture, and there's a film. So obviously she likes to work in these sort of multimedia, kind of massive, extraordinary cinematic experiences. So I wanted to show you that first. And again, we'll talk about this, but this new work considers art history, cinema, feminism, ritual, and healing, but it also presents multiple interrelated archetypes of feminist resistance, I think is probably the best way to articulate it. So if you can move on to the next slide. The work, this installation was inspired by a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi from 1616 on the right. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how the project came about and just some of the components to have people get a sense of the cinematic space.
So it all started with Artemisia, and I was invited to take part in the National Treasures Bicentenary for the National Gallery, and Icon commissioned me to make a new work or a work in response to the Artemisia painting. So I spent a lot of time with the painting. I printed it out and had it on the wall in my studio, and it was, I have to be honest, quite intimidating to be asked. It was such an honor, but it was terrifying to think that to make a work in relationship to Artemisia. Artemisia is like an icon of art and of feminist practice and like an icon of feminism, and was somebody who I had always really loved, but I had never seen a lot of Artemisia work in the flesh. So I remember when you came to Dublin, we were talking about it, and I was incredibly intimidated in how to start the project, and Maura gave me the advice, which is just go into your absolute nerd hole and read loads of books about Gentileschi and particularly St. Catherine. So I'd worked on another project the year before, which was about the archetype of Mary Magdalen called the Tower, and I had been very interested in how saints and kind of figures of saints become these kind of transmorphic kind of containers for lots of different identities for women and archetypes for women's subjectivity, and how they're actually really political. And often, like somebody like Mary Magdalen, you know, she is the Magda, the tower, the person who is the right hand of the prophet Jesus, but was completely suppressed and turned into, you know, prostitute that just like washes his feet with her hair. So, you know, which is nothing wrong with that. But what I'm saying is, like, whatever you're into, but like, there's seriously nothing wrong with that. But, you know, this sense of like really compelling historical political women are often held in these kind of saint archetypes. So I started to really look at St. Catherine and realised, reading about St. Catherine and looking into St. Catherine, that she was actually also a similar kind of character. She was actually Hypatia of Alexandria, who was an incredible astronomer and mathematician and a really public figure in the ancient world, whose public murder was considered one of the first like assassinations of a woman to be as a witch in the 4th century AD. And it is the moment that we kind of consider to be the death of the ancient world. And she's a really significant person. Hypatia, in terms of like the kind of passage into the ancient world, into the emerging world that comes after it. And her death was super public and violent and symbolic. And around the exact same time historically, the figure of St. Catherine emerges, who is a Christian who is publicly martyred by pagans, and her body is split apart across 4 like wheels and torn to pieces and beheaded, and then her martyred body is mystically elevated to Alexandria, to Mount Sinai in Egypt. So there's this strange kind of like evidence that you're looking for when you're an artist, where the research that you're doing and the veracity of the research also then has to slip into the imaginary. So having these archetypes and finding the root kind of centre, the root political centre of St. Catherine. But then the interesting thing about it is it's Hypatia and it's St. Catherine, but more importantly it's Gentileschi as these figures. So Gentileschi is saying that this is a self-portrait as St. Catherine of Alexandria. And I took that really seriously, that what we actually had in this painting was 3 women. We had a triple-headed goddess, as I like to call it, when we were talking about it in process, that we had Hypatia of Alexandria, St. Catherine and Gentileschi all together. And what they shared as figures was how they as women experienced extreme violence. And Hypatia being murdered and St. Catherine being murdered. When Artemisia paints this painting, she paints it 4 years after, or 3 years after, a very famous moment in her life, which I'm sure many of you know about, which was her rape by Agostino Tassi. And she comes away from that moment and establishes herself as a very, very successful and prolific artist by 1616. In this short period of time, it's such an incredible feminist survival story where you're back with a bang, and you're there with your wheel and your martyr's palm, and it's this sense of like almost guise and performance that really reminded me of like how contemporary feminist artists really approach the idea of performativity as this kind of like strategy of intersubjectivity and this strategy of resistance. And I think there's so many works in the show, like Juliana's work, and there's so many works in the show that really take up that call of like, what does it mean to work with performance and guise. So I was really excited once I realised that actually I could look at it as contemporary art. Then it kind of demystified it a little bit.
Until you saw it in person.
Yeah, actually,
right? When it was installed, I think you were like, oh my God.
I saw it in person, but the real kind of magic kind of moment, you're as an artist in the studio, it's like you don't have the lights on half the time and you're just like, Jesus Christ, can I just fucking see this? And you can't see anything, and then all of a sudden, it almost like it sees you and you're like, wow. So I was looking at the painting for months and months. I'd gone to see it in the National Gallery and could feel the kind of particles coming off it and just kind of going, you know, I'd be quite into this bizarre theory I have about art particles, but I'll go into that later. But I had this kind of realization when she was staring at me on my studio wall, And I was thinking about like, what is she looking at? What's around her? And I actually realised, in order for her to make that painting, she's actually staring at herself. She's actually looking in the mirror. So this idea of the mirror and the role of the self-portrait and the role of the self in reflection as a feminist strategy really emerged, and that's where the whole kind of cinematic devising came about.
See that in the film?
In the film is based on this kind of mirror world sculpture. And I worked very closely with Emma Dalesman, an amazing director of photography, to develop a sculpture that the entire performance could happen within this enclosed sculpture of self-reflection. And it's a real testament to Stephanie Lamprey, the performer, who you will have the honour of seeing perform later today, that she was able to kind of take up that space, because I don't know if you spend a lot of time looking in the mirror, I wouldn't be a fan of it. But she literally did 10-hour days.
Oh wow!
Where I was shouting at her through a mirror to kind of, you know, legend.
So another component, in addition to the self-portrait, is your self-portrait. So if we could go to the next slide. Tell us about this tableau in the foreground, right? So we have a plaster cast of your head placed on a pedestal next to a glass vessel of holy water and then a stone bowl, right? So it's this little tableau, and you can see behind is the video, which we'll talk about. And the lighting of this is so dramatic. I love this tableau. So let's talk a little bit about you're integrating your self-portrait and maybe referencing a little bit of the thurible, which has also a little bit of self-portraiture. But tell us a little bit about this.
So for me, this kind of came at a moment where I realized when I was making the work that I needed to put myself into the story. Like Gentileschi had made such a risk to make a self-portrait of herself as this character, and I felt really compelled to like kind of stand beside her in that gesture. So I made just a very simple kind of plaster head cast and placed it on the mirror, but it was really about kind of putting myself into the frame with the whole situation, where I didn't want to, one of the hardest things was I didn't want to make an artwork about Gentileschi. I wanted to make an artwork with Gentileschi. And I know that sounds really intense, but like I really wanted to try and have a bit of a seance with her. I really feel that, like, you know, there's a, for me, art history is not just something that's over. It's not over. And I actually think that what artists do is really, it's really creepy what artists do, if I'm gonna be honest with you. No, it is though. What artists do, when artists do it well, is they make kind of effectual material objects that hang around for a really long time, even after they're dead. So kind of dealing with, if we know that that's what artists do, that's creepy, right? And if we know that artists do that, then it's kind of a seance then, when two objects from two different moments in time are in the same space together. So I wanted there to be a materiality to my emotional and effectual connection to Gentileschi, and I wanted to make that manifest through an object that could sit beside it, you know?
Yeah, but is that where the water comes into play? The kind of holy water, or is that?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I just want to say I have one person very intensely to thank right now that there's holy water in this space. And the holy water is really important to the whole project, because for me, working with something from the National Gallery, London, right? It's like a national institution of the UK. And for me, there's a politics to that kind of level of engagement. And I wanted to bring something from like my national heritage to the table, and something that's also at the same, in my feeling, the same hierarchy of meaning, and that is the national, the collection of sacred water. So in Ireland, sacred water has been collected at wells for thousands and thousands of years. It's pre-Christian, and this particular well is in Brandon in County Kerry, and I've been using this water as an activation material within my work since Tremble Tremble. It appears in very subtle ways. Sometimes there's a water tap in a space where someone can be given water and drink it as any experience, and sometimes it's in a bowl where it's used to bless materials that are then handed to the audience. So it's like a protective material, and I have a lot of faith in it as a material that it always protects my artwork. So I was really hoping that we get to bring that material into the space, because I felt that we needed sacred material, and it wasn't just a symbol, it was sacred material in the space. And it's also kind of leveling out that hierarchy between what is the most important things that we collect nationally, and what is the idea of collecting as a sacred act. So this kind of folk material, or this material that's activated within a specific community, is equally as important to me as like what we do with big national collections.
And then continuing on the theme of water is the scrim curtain, the water of eels. So if you could go to the next slide, please. The well of eels, actually. So, oh, sorry, the next one. There we go.
Yeah.
There we go. So that's the curtain in the background there. It's hard to see the full image, which I didn't have, but Jessie will talk about that. Yeah.
This is Junk Ensemble that I work with quite often. They are choreographers, and when I first made the Thurible, it was like a sculpture for a performance work called Powerful Trouble that they made. And I started working with them initially on this, and they're twins, and I was just really fascinated.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they're twins. So there was this kind of twin with the head of Prudence as well, and this idea of like the boundary between two subjects, the twin. The twin always has a very interesting approach to female twins. Talk about feminism, female twins. So interesting. So we have I always work with the same people and have long collaborative relationships, and it goes deeper every time you work with them, and it just becomes more intuitive. So we were looking at like holy wells. There's a particular holy well mythology around eels, and how eels are these kind of ciphers of good omen, that if you see an eel in a well, it means that your well wish or your well healing will be granted. And we were looking at a lot of Gentileschi paintings, and in particular we looked at the painting of Cleopatra.
Oh yeah, if you could go to the next slide, I brought that up. Yeah,
so
on the left.
This painting of Cleopatra. So we just kind of use dance and movement to invert the bodies and create another version of it. And this curtain scrim is the first time I've ever made a curtain scrim that goes through the whole gallery and moves through in one singular form. Usually they kind of emerge from behind screens, and they're more in relationship to like expanded cinema. But this particular one is just, in my mind it was like a videotape. So it was like you watch the film, and then you need something to like wipe, so they're actually, as a strategy, I've been using them for a while, they're very disciplining. So I know that sounds crazy, but when you have a curtain that moves through a space, people are milling around, they're doing their own thing, and then people are generally terrified of a giant naked woman coming towards them. So it was, there needs to be a certain kind of level of, when people are in the dark, I use darkness a lot in my work, and when people are in the dark, they need to feel a sense of the uncanny, or that something is being interrupted, or there's also the space is being controlled by somebody else. So the gallery, Icon Gallery, has an amazing team of information assistants that have been kind of pulling the curtain in this kind of videotape return, and taking care of the work. And it's kind of it's an act of care by the gallery to keep the work activated and live. So for me, the hand-drawn curtain within the video installation is a way to keep the film as a live sensory space.
Right.
And it means that the work is always being cared for, because the show doesn't open unless there's somebody in the room that's going to pull the curtain. The show doesn't happen, as Lucy knows, there needs to be somebody there who's watching. And for me, that is really also about hosting and creating like a sacred space. And the curtain is also a veil, it divides up the space and creates boundaries between where you feel you can go as an audience, and then it suddenly disappears, or it goes by you really fast. So there's a level at which you feel that somebody is kind of in control of the space. when you're in the space, you know?
Yeah. I was just thinking as you were talking too that this Artemisia Gentileschi painting, talk about feminist, right? Because women who were doing, I mean, Sally and I learned this, you know, women doing nude paintings, even 18th century, I think we were reading, was considered incredibly risque. Like, how dare you do that? Here she is in the 17th century. I just never really stopped and thought about what an incredible sort of, you know, feminist endeavor it was for her to do.
And this is 2 years after a very public rape trial.
Yeah, exactly. So interesting. So if we could go to the next slide, Jessie also includes a 15th century two-headed marble portrait of Prudence that was borrowed from a collection in Birmingham. Why? Why a portrait of Prudence amidst all of this? I love the image on the left that shows Gentileschi behind too.
Yeah, I just had an instinct about Prudence as a kind of totemic figure in relationship to thinking about art history. The ability to look forward and backwards and be present in the same moment. And also it was borrowed from the Barber, which is a museum that's connected to a law school. So I had really been thinking about it in relationship to justice and jurisprudence. Myself and Lucy Mountfield, the curator, we went to view it in a very different context, you know, in a very kind of like on a very simple, modest plinth in full light, and I just thought there was something very magical that like it could be a theatrical character with it. So it was more of a kind of casting, not as a sculpture, but the pun is worth it. A casting for a character, like casting as though the space is a film and Prudence is this first character that you'd encounter, but then through absolute serendipity, which makes me realise that art is a seance. When I started researching Gentileschi, I realised that her mother was called Prudenza, and her daughter, who survived and was an artist, was also called Prudenza. So we end up with Gentileschi being sandwiched between two Prudenzas. So it's that kind of thing. Like it's literally evidence that I do think it is a seance.
And again, it shows the incredible research that I think you know, like her mother's name. Like the amount of research that Jessie puts into her productions are mind blowing. I mean, they're more than like scholars I know who write books. It's like incredible. You can quote from like Mary Garrard, who's like the #1 expert on Artemisia Gentileschi. It's mind blowing to me. But also, you had mentioned to me at one point that you like this because, you know, it links Artemisia Gentileschi to the future idea of feminism and the patriarchal past of art history. I think that was a really beautiful way to articulate it as well, right?
Like I feel like, you know, it's not about, as a feminist and an artist, it's not about like only recuperation as a strategy. It's also about something else, which is, you know, dealing with the past as something that can be retold or transformed, or, you know, that just shifting what the materiality of the past is. And I think that sounds really dodgy, but I mean it that like artists can do it. Like artists have like this kind of plastic, imaginative way of dealing with history and stories that, you know, we can kind of suspend the veracity of something and allow it. What if it's art, and what if we experience it as art? And I think there's so many works in this exhibition that really allow that to happen, and it's really exciting to be an artist. It's really fun being an artist.
All right, so we'll talk about the final component, which is the film, and we'll see a clip of that in a second. But really mesmerizing new 16mm film that Jessie did with her DOP, who's here this evening. And it's inspired by Christine de Pizan's 15th century text, The Book of the City of Ladies. I'd love for you to talk about the film in relation to Pizan, Mount Sinai, St. Catherine.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many complex layers associated with this new film.
Yeah, there's a lot, but it's also about, you know, for me, I have a drawing practice, which is reading historical texts from the medieval period.
Wow.
So,
wow.
But no, really, like I will read like a lot of texts, and I will kind of just sketch in my notebook, just phrases and words. And, you know, I read a lot of Christine de Pizan, and then after reading so much, I just became obsessed with one poem that she wrote called Soleil des Suies. And it was a beautiful poem that she wrote after her husband died. And I just became obsessed with one word from the poem, Soleil, Soleil, Soleil. And having read the entire book of the City of Ladies, just granularly found one word, and you'll see in the performance and you'll see in the
I
film
didn't know that.
that there's a granular aspect. It's the entire story of Christine Pizza is held in one word, and I guess that's about thinking about like language and the plasticity and the kind of granularity of the poetics of language. So yeah, I think I forget which one on top.
Yeah, and I'll ask a follow-up question. If we can go to the next slide, if you don't mind. Let's talk, before we play it, let's talk a little bit about the score, right? Composed by Irene Buckley, starring Stephanie Lamprey, and featuring the music of a 17th century composer, Francesca Caccini, who was a contemporary and friend of Gentileschi. So really interesting score. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it also has Monteverde.
Oh, right, exactly.
But in reverse.
Right.
But there's one or two lines that are Monteverde, Addio Roma. The whole way of thinking about the music was, I was reading Jessie Locker, who's also an incredible scholar on Gentileschi, and Locker was talking about how Gentileschi not only was an incredible painter, but she basically was there for the birth of Italian opera and the Donna Fuerte and the kind of characterization of women as these really powerful, dramatic women that, it wasn't over until they sang the last part of the story, so a lot of this kind of milieu that Gentileschi was in Venice, in Florence. She was in Venice at the same time as Monteverde. Monteverde writes Addio Roma after that period of time. Addio Roma is this really like heartbreaking story about leaving Rome, leaving your homeland. Then when she goes to Florence in around the time that she makes Self-Portrait as St. Catherine, she becomes friends with Francesca Caccini, whose father was also Guido Caccini, who wrote Ave Maria, which is a pretty famous song. So they had this thing in common where they both had super famous dads. So they were like Nepo babies? the Nepo babies of Florence that were like, oh, our dads are so famous. What are we going to do? Our dads are so famous, but let's just be absolute geniuses. So they were just incredible, and she writes this, Caccini writes this beautiful, beautiful piece of music that you will hear later this evening. And I just felt like Francesca Caccini, because she was Gentileschi's friend, I felt like to make the film, she needed to have her friend with her and to make the show where her friend was in the space with her. And it was this kind of moment of like bringing Caccini and Gentileschi back together as these kind of people that were mates in their 20s. And Francesca Caccini was there after the rape trial, and she was kind of, everybody has a mate that is there for them when they most need it. And I just felt like that's a really feminist act to bring those women back together. So that was the kind of brief for me, was to make a soundscape that reanimated that idea of the Donna Fuerte and that kind of birth of opera around the milieu of Gentileschi's work in that moment of mid 17th century, early 17th century Italy. But the very simple gesture of doing it was, I worked with Irene Buckley on a lot of projects, and Irene and myself started kind of developing the score using maps, and we based it on the map of Mount Sinai, where the body of St. Catherine was mystically elevated to for her martyrdom. So we just took apart the kind of mountainscape. I'm a very visual thinker, so I was like, can we do something like this? I was also obsessed with John Cage's aria from 58.
Oh, that's great.
And I love it so much.
Yeah.
I listen to that to relax. So
you listen to that to relax.
So I was really obsessed with it, and I said to Irene, can we find a performer that could do something like that kind of really the garbled videotape way of dealing with the voice. And Irene was like, there's nobody that can do that, Jessie, come on. And I was like, please. And then she was like, okay, Stephanie Lamprey, she's based in Glasgow, you have to meet her. And it kind of took off from there. So the score turned into this kind of sprawling thing where it began with Irene. It began obviously in the 17th century with Francesca Caccini and Monteverde. Again, I use a lot of reverse, so I know that Chiara Fumai's work also uses reverse. So we reversed Monteverde. So we got the Monteverde to sing backwards.
Yeah.
So
And Stephanie is as well, isn't she?
Stephanie is singing Monteverde backwards. Right. So I'm very interested in that kind of reverse of language. I had a fantasy for a long time to do a reverse opera and to have the voice go back into the body, like a manna, like a manna that you particles that you eat, So it was kind of, for me, it was a very magical kind of dream come true to work in this way with incredibly talented people. And just as soon as we were all in the room together, just flowed and turned into a thing.
Stephanie, kudos to you for singing Monteverde backwards. That's incredible. Oh my God. Because it's garbled and harrowing, and I didn't realize that's ultimately what was happening. I thought you were trying to make it like incredibly opaque, so that and then eventually the Hypatia kind of slaughter emerges towards the end, right? That kind of the ultimate moment. So let's look at a clip of this film. We just chose about 4 minutes.
Can I just check? It starts black.
It doesn't.
I should have checked, but I'm not sure that it's actually.
It starts quite dark.
Right?
Quite dark. Yeah.
I think we started late. And we're almost done. Amazing piece, and that's only a small portion of it. Yeah, so we wanted to try, just in the last few minutes that we have here together, to discuss some of the conceptual links between Tremble Tremble, where we started, and this, Mirror Martyr, Mirror Moon. And one of the things that Jessie and I have spoken about, in relation to this connection, is how she wants to capture this sense of the body as a machine for text, right? So you can see the similarities, I think, conceptually between what we just saw and Owen as the giant, kind of just declaring the law as we saw. So maybe we talk a little bit about that, the sort of sound objects, right, that you've spoken to me about rather than language, right? Seeing them as objects, I think is what you said, right?
I think that comes from the idea of what testimony is, and going to trials and observing how, I guess in particular, women's testimony is difficult to believe, and there's kind of a credibility thing around testimony, and the text that Stephanie's speaking in that section, we had played around with it and she'd spoke it a lot. It's from a book by Maria Duzelska, which is about Hypatia, and there's this section that describes Hypatia's murder in Alexandria, where she was torn to pieces by the Alexandrians, and her body was shamefully treated, and parts of it were scattered all over the city, and it just felt like such an intense description of violence. And at the time we were making the work and making the soundtrack, we were also watching what was happening in Gaza every day, and this feeling of like the repetition of extreme violence, to a point where the credibility is questioned, to a point where the repetition of it becomes an even deeper violence because it loses meaning. It's like that thing of like that Chekhov talks about, and again, the violence is in the repetition, the violence is in the again. So we played around with the text of Hypatia's murder and tried to think about it not as words and meaning, but as a videotape coming through the throat, just getting reefed and ranked through the throat. And it really reminded me of like that, how stories are extracted from people, and the double violence of having to tell people what happened to you. Like it's such a, it's like you have to suffer again to speak about it. But then to me the most violent thing is when you're not believed, when you issue that testimony and you've pulled it out of your body and then nobody fucking believes you, and then you have to say it again, and you have to say it again, and you have to say it again until your body completely breaks down with this idea that the language around the testimony of what has happened to you is the thing that finally fucking breaks you. And
Miranda Fricker, you had spoken about, right, the epistemic injustice.
There's a great legal humanities writer that some people might be aware of, Miranda Fricker, and she talks about this. She talks about the Cassandra complex and how women's testimony and marginalised people's testimony is often not believed because it doesn't fit with the narratives of power. It's uncomfortable. It's problematic. It doesn't help reproduce the kind of world that power wants to reproduce. It kind of goes against that. So it's often excluded, or its practices of dialogue are often kind of minimised, or marginalised even deeper. So I was really interested in working with a performer who could really, like, I'm so lucky with the performers I work with, like they go deep. So I kind of asked Stephanie, would she say the lines to a point where it makes her feel nauseous? Could she keep saying it over and over and over and over and over and over again, like that kind of Chekhov thing of like, say it until you feel sick, say it until it feels like you're falling out of an airplane. And we actually, thanks to Emma, we had a lot of 16mm film, and we rolled that by, like, winging it, and we practiced it in the dressing room, and it just kind of came into the room as a very intense tornado of creativity between the two of us and between Emma. and we just shot it and rolled the entire section in one take with 16mm film, and everybody was standing around going, "She's fucking wasting film." But then once it started, people were like, "Is that really happening?" And I suppose for me, that's also the point. The reason why I went back to 16mm for this project was the idea that the materiality of the film would come out of the camera and touch against the body of Stephanie and touch against her voice and seal it there in a very different way. And then, strangely, by total coincidence, but then there's never coincidence.
The date of the painting.
The
Isn't
date
that?
of the painting.
Oh, I didn't know that. I was guessing,
So
actually.
I had no idea that I was making a film that was exactly 16 minutes long until I was in the edit suite, and because this 4-minute section, it became 16 minutes long. So it was on 16mm and it was exactly 16 minutes long, and the Gentileschi painting was painted in 1616.
Yep.
So I was like,
ooh, it's so creepy. It's so witchy.
It's so witchy. I know, but like, look, I'm not being bad about it, but you know, we are talking about very creepy stuff when we're talking about art. To me, creepy is not a bad word. It's just, you know, we're talking about something that kind of lingers and hangs around and has that effective possibility. There's no way we could only think of it from the rational world. And for me, that's the value of coming back to art history from a feminist perspective, from a decolonising perspective, because maybe they didn't get it right. Maybe that way of like rational, you know, one moment supplants another in the historical narrative. You know the way it goes. Maybe that's not the right way of looking at art history. Maybe it's some other kind of seance that's actually happening. And for me, that's not a weird thing. I grew up, my mom is a psychic, and I grew up around a lot of storytelling, you know? Like all it is psychic storytelling, and I grew up with that as a very strong folk practice that was very much part of my domestic life since I was a kid. And I kind of learned how my mother would tell stories about people's lives, that they would be entranced and bewitched and compelled. And you know, she'd hold she was tea leaf reader, so she'd hold a tea leaf cup, and oh my god, you could hear a pin drop. Wow. It was such a brilliant education in stagecraft to know with that from a young age. Like, you know, I learned so much from seeing how people would like, oh, you know, it's compelling.
Now let's bring the thurible back, right? So let's relate this object here to Mirror Martyr, Mirror Moon, and tell folks how we're going to get to the present using those two things.
Yeah, so I made this work last year, and it was very strange because I made it just the week I had a really dramatic injury and had to get surgery and ended up in hospital, and then my studio had to be set up in my bedroom. So I completed this work while I just gotten out of surgery, and it actually kind of saved me in a lot of ways because it brought me back into my body in a kind of physical, sculptural way. And then it was activated as part of a dance work by Junk Ensemble called Powerful Trouble, which was about the history of archetypes of witches. I had been really obsessed with like the Buta Femero in Santiago de Compostela, and in a lot of ways I am from like historically a very effecto-spheric Catholic culture, even though, like, you know, Elvis was bigger than Jesus in my house, but still,
tell them what your middle name is.
Well, Presley.
Jesse Presley Jones. Talk about Elvis being big.
Yeah, Elvis
anyway,
was
sorry,
very
so
big.
go ahead.
Well, there was this constant sense of like, I know a lot of people in the room came from a Catholic kind of background, and what Catholic background does, it gives you a sense of like aesthetics.
Yeah,
and power.
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
And so much of art history is connected to that as well. So there's a language around affect that you just are affected by as a Catholic. And I remember a few years ago I was talking to my friend Sylvia, and she also grew up in Italy as a Catholic, and she's an incredible, obviously, like, you know, anarcho-feminist historian. and she was saying, you know, if I even smell frankincense,
Yeah.
I almost have a panic attack.
So do I do.
Because-
I definitely
yeah,
do.
it's so affecting,
absolutely.
it's so disturbing.
Mhm.
So I kind of had that brief in my mind that I'd love to make a thurible that Sylvia could get behind. That, you know, what if we made a thurible but it's super witchy, and instead of filling it with frankincense, we fill it with, like, you know, Palo Santo, and the hair, there's human hair in it that's been collected from everyone that works in the gallery.
It's like an anti-thurible.
Yeah, it's an anti-thurible.
Anti-thurible.
It's an anti-thurible.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of sense, that kind of sense of reversal or change, or taking something that goes one way and sending it back the other. So the thurible throws back the thurible from Santiago de Compostela, but uses its, I love using Catholic magic for other means. It feels like you're hacking something. It feels a bit like you're changing what it's for, but it's still a pretty useful tool for holding a space and holding energy. And I think that they stole it from us in the first place. So it's nice to just take back some of the magic, because I think that magic was really, they tried to kill magic with the rise of capitalism and the rise of, like, theocratic capitalism. They tried to destroy magic, and I think it's important for me as a political act to bring back or reappropriate the magic structures.
And divert it for other means.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. I think we have come full circle, I hope. And I think we're done. We've been talking for a while. Are you ready to perform?
Yeah, so what we're going to do now is Stephanie has a beautiful performance presentation that she has prepared for you. We need to do a little bit of changing with the chairs, so ideally if people would like to go upstairs, there's incredible artworks to have a look at, and then come back down and we'll have Stephanie's performance.
Great, thank you.